Good evening. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to be here to talk about MAPS and psychedelic research. I've named my talk Healing People, Healing Policies, Political Implications of Psychedelic Research because, well, I was actually just in DC, and I definitely can think of a few policymakers who could benefit from some psychedelic healing, and I would definitely be curious to see the impact of psychedelic therapy on their policymaking, but I digress. I believe that just as psychedelic therapy works by encouraging individuals to address the root cause of their difficulties, and precisely because it works this way, psychedelic therapy as a modality forces us to examine the societal and political causes of trauma, which I hope will eventually lead to systems and policies that work to prevent and heal rather than create and perpetuate trauma. So tonight, I'm going to use this lens to tell you a bit about MAPS and the work that we do and give you a bit of a research update. So MAPS stands for the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. That's 19 syllables. Those syllables are especially fun when I'm lobbying in DC, meeting with Republican staffers, and I start to say multidisciplinary association, and they're kind of nodding their head, and then I get to psychedelic, and then you see their eyes kind of light up, but then they immediately try to disguise that and pretend they didn't just respond that way. It's really entertaining, and I also find it pretty fascinating that psychedelics really do inspire that kind of reaction. And it's certainly not just with Republican staffers either. Although I must say, in this most recent trip, I met with a staffer from Senator Gillibrand's office, and he turned out to be a burner, so maybe that light up in his eyes meant something a little different. So MAPS is a nonprofit research and education organization. We're actually essentially a nonprofit pharmaceutical company because we are developing or doing drug development in a nonprofit context. However, if all continues going well, we estimate by 2021 we will have MDMA approved as prescription medicine, and we will start to turn a profit. So last January, we created the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, which now houses our entire clinical team and allows us to make social benefit the primary purpose rather than profit. MAPS, as I mentioned, works to develop psychedelics and cannabis into prescription medicine. We train therapists and we're working to establish a network of treatment centers. We support scientific research into spirituality, creativity, and neuroscience. And we educate the public honestly about the risks and benefits of cannabis. Just to give you a visual of our future MAPS psychedelic therapy clinic. So though MAPS sponsors and supports research with a number of different psychedelics, as Dr. Natalie mentioned, our focus remains with MDMA, and MDMA actually inspired MAPS founding. MDMA increases the release of serotonin in the brain and also norepinephrine and dopamine, and it also enhances the release of the hormones oxytocin, prolactin, vasopressin, and cortisol, which can have psychoactive effects including enhanced feelings of love, empathy, euphoria, trust, and decreased fear, which we find very useful in a therapeutic context. So, as I mentioned, MDMA was kind of inspired MAPS's founding because Rick, MAPS's founder and director, founded MAPS immediately after MDMA was first criminalized. When MDMA first kind of emerged in the early 70s, it was known as Adam, and it existed almost exclusively in therapeutic contexts. Therapists used it for couples therapy, phobias, and just a wide assortment of things. But in 1983, a distribution network decided to call Adam ecstasy and target the club scene, and use mushroomed. This increase in use also correlated with an escalation of the war on drugs. So MDMA, or ecstasy, caught the attention of the DEA, and the DEA wanted to schedule MDMA into Schedule 1, which, according to the Controlled Substance Act of 1970, means that it has no potential for abuse, high potential for abuse, no accepted medical use, and no accepted safety for use under medical supervision. However, a team of doctors, therapists, and religious leaders tried to challenge the scheduling, and the DEA ended up holding hearings for 2 years. So after 2 years of hearing, the DEA's own judge ruled that MDMA should actually be placed in Schedule 3 because it has such a low potential for abuse and it has an accepted medical use. But unfortunately, the DEA consistently rejects science and logic and rejected even their own judge's ruling and continued to put MDMA in Schedule 1 in 1986. And so MAPS embarked on its 30-year journey to demonstrate MDMA's safety and efficacy as medicine. So the one benefit of criminalization is that it inspired a lot of research to try to show the harms of MDMA. We estimate there's been over $300 million worth of research. And Rick likes to call this the Aikido strategy because in order to do the clinical research that we're doing, you do need to have a good amount of safety research that would be very expensive, and as a nonprofit organization, we might not have been able to afford that. So it was we did our Aikido using all of the research that had been done, and we're able to submit that to the FDA for our clinical research. So today I will be focusing on our MDMA research for PTSD because PTSD is the indication that we're working towards FDA approval for. But I just want to give a brief overview of the other research that we're doing. We have an MDMA-assisted psychotherapy study for social anxiety in people on the autism spectrum. And that's taking place in LA. And we've already had some pretty exciting results. Like one participant had never held a job, and he's 40 years old and just got his first job after going through the study. Another participant just went on his first date. So there's some exciting results. Another study we have going on locally in Marin is MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for treatment of anxiety associated with life-threatening illness. In Marin. And we also are about to start a cannabis study for PTSD, which, strangely enough, our cannabis research has actually been harder to get off the ground than our research with MDMA or LSD, and that's a talk for another time, but there have been tremendous barriers to the cannabis research, and we're excited to finally be starting soon at Johns Hopkins and in Arizona. And we received a $2.1 million grant from the state of Colorado to do this research, but have still been having difficulties with the federal barriers. But now to our main study right now, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. So just to give a little orientation, PTSD is a condition where the sufferer re-experiences trauma repeatedly, and that makes it very difficult to engage with the outside world or even friends and family. And PTSD can be especially difficult for loved ones of people suffering, which is actually, we just received approval recently to do a couples study where one member of the couple has PTSD, but both members of the couple get to receive MDMA therapy together. So we're really excited about that. PTSD is highly related to depression, addiction, and suicide. And upwards of 22 veterans commit suicide every day. And more veterans die by their own hand than die fighting. And I say upwards of 22 veterans because there is an epidemic of prescription opiate overdoses among veterans and among the general population as well, and many of those overdoses are not included in these suicide numbers. And even with these horrible rates of PTSD among returning war veterans, which is around 20%, there are actually populations in this country that have even far higher rates of PTSD. For example, one study of a low-income, predominantly black neighborhood in Atlanta showed that the population had a significantly higher rate of PTSD than returning war veterans. And I've had the privilege of watching hours of MDMA therapy session tapes, and actually a majority of the veterans who go through therapy often end up processing a lot of early childhood trauma. So I think it's really important to remember with PTSD that trauma comes from all different points in one's life, and it's not ever easily constricted. The VA spends $4 to $6 billion annually to help treat veterans deal with their PTSD, and unfortunately, it's failing miserably. And I love this image from National Geographic of a veteran wearing a mask that he created through an art therapy program. He says he was inspired by Hannibal Lecter. So right now, there are only 2 FDA-approved medicines to treat PTSD, Zoloft and Paxil, and they fail 75% of people. 75% of people do not respond to these FDA-approved medicines or to the psychotherapy. Now, it's not a perfect comparison because with our MDMA study, this was only with 20 people, so we do have to keep that in mind. But with this study of 20 people in one of our sites, MDMA therapy was 83% effective in eliminating PTSD. So to compare that to a 75% failure rate is pretty dramatic. Therapies that are officially recognized by the APA to treat PTSD include CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, psychodynamic psychotherapy, and pharmacotherapy. Less widely recognized treatments are more kind of holistic and body-centered therapies that aim to connect psychological symptoms to physiological states, include Hakomi, internal family systems, yoga, and with psychedelic therapy, we encourage our participants to use many of these holistic practices to help integrate their experiences. Our therapeutic approach for MDMA-assisted therapy is a non-directive approach, and we believe in supporting the emerging experience. Our methods are adopted from Dr. Stan Grof and many others, and the therapist's goal is to provide a safe space for the participant so that the participant's own experience can unfold and they can kind of work to do their own healing. And we use the term inner healer or inner intelligence and really encourage the participant to lead the experience. We have a co-therapist team because they are 8-hour sessions, and sometimes the participant will be working out something with their parents and need kind of 2 people to project on, and it just works really well to have 2 therapists. So within that 8-hour session, participant alternates between periods of going inside, we call it, where they can have the option of putting on headphones and listening to music and eye shades and just seeing what comes up, and then sitting up, talking, moving, just whatever the participant feels they want to be doing. Dr. Michael Midhofer, who with his wife Annie Midhofer created our MDMA-assisted therapy treatment manual, gives this great explanation that I want to read to you. When I worked in the ER, somebody came in with this big gash on their arm full of gravel. I don't know how to heal that. My job is to create favorable conditions for the inner healing intelligence to be able to do it. So get the gravel out, bring the sides closer together, irrigate it, and then the body always moves towards healing. What can happen is that things get in the way. Infection, not enough blood supply, a foreign body left in there. So in a way, our job in the ER is to remove the obstacles to healing. I think it's very much the same with the psyche. I think there's this movement towards healing, and there's a lot that can get in the way of that. And I think this is a really important concept, that it's about individuals healing themselves rather than doctors coming in and fixing people. And I think this is something that we can really think about applying elsewhere and beyond this context, because the inner healer, exists without psychedelics as well, even though psychedelics definitely help it emerge in certain spaces. So to give you an overview of our clinical sites right now across the country and across the world, we have our site with the Midhofers in Charleston. We completed a site in Switzerland. We have space in Vancouver and in Israel and in Boulder, Colorado. But as you can see, our sample size is just over 100 people for phase 2. So while our results are extremely promising, phase 3 will really be essential to demonstrate efficacy in a larger population. And we're almost finished with phase 2, and we'll be starting phase 3 next year. Sorry. So this is the study design for our MDMA therapy. To walk you through the process quickly, we start with a pretty intensive screening process, because we have to exclude conditions like cardiovascular conditions or certain psychotic conditions. And participants have to have chronic treatment-resistant PTSD, which means that they have to have tried multiple other treatments and failed in order to be accepted into our study. These little green lines indicate sessions with the therapist. So before we have any sessions with medicine, there are 3 prep sessions. And these are really essential because, as you can see, we call this MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. And it's not just about taking the MDMA, but the psychotherapy component and the container for the process is really essential to the outcome. Because participant really needs to develop trust and feel safe working with the therapist in order for them to have good experiences with their medicine sessions. And then, so after 3 prep sessions, the participant comes for a session with medicine, and it's a blinded session, which means that neither the participant nor the therapist knows if the participant has a full dose, a medium dose, or an active placebo dose. So after they have their 8-hour session with these 2 therapists, the participants spend the night afterward in the clinic, and then that morning they have their first integration session with the therapists. The therapists then call the participants every day for 7 days, and the therapists are also always available by phone throughout this process. And then the participants have 2 more follow-up sessions before their next experimental session. And that whole process repeats, and they have 3 integration sessions after. And then this red bar indicates the unblinding, where participants and therapists discover what dose that the participant received. And if the participant got a medium dose or an active placebo dose, they are able to get 3 full dose sessions afterward. And if the participant had gone full dose, they get their 3rd session. And then we do a long-term follow-up after a year. So some of the most common adverse reactions in MDMA sessions include things like jaw clenching or muscle tension or headaches. And I've highlighted this green here because that's actually from the active placebo dose. And many of these reactions are also common in PTSD, regardless of the MDMA. And most of these symptoms resolve after the drug wears off, and the rest resolve within a few days.
Can you tell us the milligrams for the medium high dose?
So we're actually not supposed to reveal that, but I can give you an approximation. The full dose is between 100 and 125. A medium dose is between 60 and 80. And then the active placebo dose is around 30 to 50, around 20 to 40, let's call it. So I've chosen to present our newest data from a Charleston site that's focused on veterans, firefighters, and police officers. So the green line is the full active dose, the orange is the medium dose, and the blue is the active placebo. The y-axis represents the CAPS scores, and CAPS are the clinician-administered PTSD scale, and that is the way of evaluating severity of PTSD. And this black line across the middle shows 50, like the 50 CAPS score, where above 50 qualifies as PTSD and below doesn't. So as you can see, all the participants started around 80, 90, and the participants who received both the medium and the full dose dropped well below 50, while the active dose did not. Here's another chart also including a longer-term follow-up with an average of 3.5 years later, showing that actually results continue to improve after the study with more integration and more follow-up. We also measure things like depression using Beck's depression inventory, and depression also greatly declines, as you can see in the medium and active doses. But it is interesting to note that even our active placebo in both cases decreases slightly, and we credit our wonderful therapists and the rest of the experience with helping these participants, even if it isn't as much as with the medicine. But with all these graphs, I think it's most helpful to hear from the participants themselves. So this is Nicholas Blackston. He was a veteran and a MAP study participant, and this is actually a self-portrait that he drew after his sessions. And he says, "I had a profound moment. I guess it felt like a bird's eye view of how everything went down in Iraq and why it happened. I was a machine gunner. I was supposed to take anyone out before they take us out. And getting hit was my responsibility, and my driver dying weighed a lot on me. I had that guilt for the longest time. During MDMA therapy, I saw my whole past completely differently. It no longer became something that was haunting me." Rachel Hope is another study participant who is a sexual assault survivor. And she says, "For 20 years, I wanted to be free, and I didn't get any real healing until MDMA-assisted therapy. It opened me up to my greatest abilities to contribute to mankind. It doesn't just help the individual taking the medicine, but it will help everyone they touch." So as I watched some the hours of therapy tapes, I was really struck that many of the traumatic experiences recounted from war had more to do with perpetrating violence. So Garrett Reppenhagen was not a participant in our study, but I thought this quote really captured a lot of what I was seeing in some of these sessions. Garrett says, "I was taken aside more than once at the VA during group therapy and told that the VA is not a platform to express my political views. To me, my recovery hinged on the fact that I felt guilt and shame over committing atrocities against an occupied country. We went over there and brutalized and oppressed, and that is part of my psychological and moral injuries. If I can't talk about it at the VA, then the VA can't help me." And I think this brings up a lot of really interesting questions and kind of forces us to examine the line that we like to draw between, perpetrator and victim, and understanding that violence really traumatizes absolutely everyone involved. And even beyond a context of war, keeping this in mind, this blur of perpetrator and victim, I think it's interesting to think about what that means about our, criminal justice system. Clearly, there are a lot of societal implications to this work, because trauma itself is both personal and political. But also, let me be clear, not all MDMA therapy participants magically become peacenik hippies, though some of them definitely grown their hair out a bit more after. But they still do have a much greater understanding of how violence impacted them and how that manifests in various forms in their life. Psychedelic therapy inspires people to ask questions to understand the greater context. Psychedelic therapy will have obvious impacts on policy as psychedelics are approved as medicine and start to be rescheduled. And hopefully we can start building a path towards decriminalization and eventually legalization. But I think it's really important to think about how medical cannabis and psychedelics impact things like the pharmaceutical industry that is predicated on patients relying on taking pills daily for years at a time, and how something like psychedelics that can require just one session can really be more healing, and what that says. I mean, I think it's interesting to think like what it says about our society that there hasn't been adequate incentive to push through medicines that actually heal because there isn't enough profit incentive. I recently heard Gabor Mate speak here at CIIS, and he was talking about his upcoming book that was going to be focused on the trauma of capitalism, and I think that would be very interesting. So I guess to leave you, I want to leave you with a few questions. One is that until we have legal access to psychedelic therapy, what lessons can we learn from its successes that we can apply right now? And if psychedelic therapy forces us to examine the societal and political causes of trauma, how can we ensure that this leads to new systems and policies that work to prevent and heal rather than create and perpetuate trauma? Thank you.
Let me bring the mic to you, though, if you have a question.
How did you measure the different degrees of PTSD?
Sure. The CAPS, are you asking about the CAPS scale? So that's kind of the standard measurement of PTSD, and it's a series of questions that we have for our studies. Independent raters that are not the therapists administer these CAPS questionnaires before and after sessions, and that's the standardized way of measuring PTSD.
Were there any brain scans involved?
No. Though we are doing a sub-study on one of our sites that's going to involve brain imaging, but that is not related to the psychotherapy part of the research.
What exactly is an active placebo?
So active placebo means a very low dose, because in order to try to create a blinded atmosphere, MDMA does have we thought that it would have a very obvious effect, so they wanted to put a little, to understand it from a smaller dose, but actually moving forward, I think we're going to just do an actual placebo that's not active, because we worried that just that little bit might have actually made things a little bit more difficult, because it kind of stirs something up but doesn't really give you the full experience.
So just let me bring you the mic, that way we can record the questions. Nana?
Yeah, it just looked to me like it was very heavily loaded to male definitions, the male, the soldier, the policeman, and I'm a little concerned about that. Was that corrected later? What were your final kind of gender numbers?
I'm glad you brought that up, and a majority of our veterans have been male, though many women definitely experience PTSD, both from sexual trauma within the military and other trauma. We have in our earlier studies had more women who were, we have had women also in our studies, but I think it is an issue in general to look at the populations that we've dealt with, because another thing that I'm struck by is that the vast majority of our participants are white as well. And we know that the most highly traumatized populations in this country are people of color, and that women are more, have higher rates of trauma than men. So that is definitely something we need to focus on. So thank you for bringing that up.
You had mentioned some of the specific qualities of MDMA as opposed to LSD or psilocybin, and I was wondering how the system that was developed catered to MDMA specifically, and I was interested in the tactile and sensorial increase.
When you say the system, you mean the
Your
therapy?
protocol, like how you were having the
Sure.
therapy sessions. And
So MDMA we find to be particularly helpful with trauma because so in other studies with psilocybin, for example, things like mystical experiences have a really high correlation with the efficacy of the treatment. But actually in our studies, we've even found in some cases the medium dose works even better than the higher dose. So we think with MDMA, there's something about not being kind of too out of your normal space, and like that allows you to help process and take what you've experienced and integrate that. Is that kind of what you're...
I guess I'm wondering how you're using increased sensation specifically as a part of what the
like
substance can
physical
do.
sensation?
Yeah.
Therapists definitely help encourage the participant to focus on their feelings in their body, and they talk a lot about body work, and often in sessions you'll see people dancing around a bit, moving. Sometimes they get up and dance. So we do try to integrate that kind of work into the therapy sessions.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, you mentioned that you are doing follow-up for PTSD, but as well you are measure depression. Are you doing the follow-up as well? And if yes, for how long?
We are doing that follow-up as well, but it's for the year.
Maybe one more question. There was like the full dose, middle dose, and low dose. There was different results for full dose and the middle dose. There is the expression why the middle dose works. It looks like that middle dose works a little bit better than the full dose.
Yes. As I was explaining, it did, and that was kind of one site, and that hasn't always been the case, but we are finding that very interesting, and our hypothesis is that the higher dose takes the person kind of farther out of their normal space, and so that middle dose might have been more helpful in a therapeutic way and helps them kind of integrate. But that's just a theory, and that was the case with that one sample size of 20, but we have many sites, and that hasn't always been the case.
I was curious what their orientation or history was towards psychedelics or MDMA before the study.
The participants?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good question. There's a limit. They don't have to be naive, but they can't. I forget the exact number, but I think they can't have taken MDMA more than like 3 or 5 times. And then if they use like cannabis, they have to stop smoking cannabis for like 2 months beforehand. But they don't have to be completely naive, but they also can't have taken it a bunch.
So do you require they have had taken it?
No.
Okay.
No. And many of the participants had never tried MDMA before. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Concerning the dosage, and just wondering, was there any averaging out for dosage and body weight, or body mass index, or fat content?
A
or
good
whatever?
question, and no, there wasn't.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, one more. What were the age groups involved in the studies?
It's a good. I'm not sure of the exact range. I know everyone has to be over 18. And I'm trying, just from the sessions I've watched, I would say mostly like late 20s, early 30s, but there really has been a very wide range. So, yeah. There's one more question over here.
Thanks so much. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on the research studies involving adult autism.
Sure. Do you have any specific questions about it?
I think specifically, what was their reaction, and what was the process by which they were helped, if that makes sense. What
sure.
was it that happened where they were able to, go on that first date that you talked about?
Yeah. So The process is very similar to the PTSD treatment with the 8-hour sessions and spending the night and all of that, like, kind of layout. And we've just seen in the social anxiety scales, their numbers have dropped dramatically. And, you know, to me, that I'm interested in what that means in terms of their dating or their ability to keep a job. But I think that the MDMA, you know, creates more feelings of connectedness and empathy, and these feelings, I think, help people with autism move past certain barriers. Like, another participant had never been able to make eye contact with the therapist, and then was able to after the sessions. And this study is relatively new, so I think we've had like maybe around 10 participants so far. But it's definitely interesting, and there's a lot more information on our website, and I definitely recommend looking into that if you're interested.
I'm going to bring the mic. This will be our last question for now.
I wonder how much thought you put into the environment that you conduct these sessions with. The one slide you showed was this sterile, windowless room, and very clinical and medical. I think that would really bum me out if I run under the influence of a psychedelic.
I know. I think that might have been just a bad angle, because I'm also glad you asked that, because we put a lot of thought into it. And that room is actually in this beautiful cottage by the seaside outside of Charleston. And it is a really...
That's a relief to hear that. Yeah.
Yes. No, that's very important, certainly. And I'm glad you brought that up, because creating the space to feel safe and feel comfortable is a very integral part of the healing. And like our site in Marin has this beautiful outdoor space, and we put a lot of thought into that. I know it's always hard to have pictures of the therapy, because people have the it's a weird image, but participants speak really highly of the setting and the experience too.
Let's give Natalie a round of applause.